Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Davis, and I'm the clinical research manager over the immune effector cell clinical research nurses. My journey started here at City of Hope in 2017, where I came from another local community hospital, or regional hospital, from the oncology floor, where I was there for 5 years before coming to City of Hope. There I gave oncology therapies and was charging and precepting over there. Came to City of Hope and then started as a clinical research nurse, where I've been in research ever since. In the beginning of 2022, I moved over to the immunotherapy team, where I worked with hematological and solid tumor cancers as a CRN, then as a team lead, and now eventually as a manager. So today we're going to be putting together the pieces of what a clinical trial team is and what their roles are. So we're going to be looking at a high level what the trial sponsor is responsible for, because I know that you guys have talked about that already, but also responsibilities for following the clinical team members. Primarily, we're going to be looking at principal investigators, what their roles and responsibilities are, clinical research nurses, clinical research coordinators, clinical data managers, and regulatory associates. So to begin with, the responsibilities of the trial sponsor. Primarily, they're responsible for filing and maintaining an effective investigational drug, new drug status within the FDA, providing study structure via the study protocol, investigator brochures, and other study materials to qualified study investigators and their teams to be able to conduct the trials. So you've seen some of that when Stacy was showing the X page that came from, a hypothetical protocol. And that's really the information that we pull and use to follow the study. This sponsor is responsible for conducting and monitoring to ensure that research activities are being conducted in accordance with the trial protocol in the IND, and reporting all significant new adverse events or risks with respect to the drug to the FDA in a timely manner. So those are the main things that they're responsible for. And our job is to make sure that we continue to support that function as well. The roles that we're going to discuss today are, again, the principal investigator, the clinical research nurse, the clinical research coordinator, the clinical data coordinator, and the regulatory associate. So the principal investigator, also known as the PI, is ultimately responsible for the oversight of research-related activities. So it's his or her job to make sure that the job gets done. One of the most important responsibilities is to ensure the ethical conduct of the study and the staff, which involves making sure that the rights, safety, and general welfare of the patient is protected. To do this, the PI relies on the whole team of individuals to guide them in protecting and putting together a successful study. While it would be convenient if a PI were to come up with a concept for a study and then within a week or two go ahead and roll it out into the clinic, that's not really the way we do research. I know many of them would like to, but we want to make sure that we're protecting the product that's going to be coming out and making sure that we're adhering to the scientific standards, and also protecting the research participants, most importantly. There is a web of intersecting and overlapping agencies and standards that have put in place specifically to do just that, to protect the product and to protect the patient. Primary PI responsibilities include overseeing all persons assisting with the trial. This means that they're making sure that the trial personnel are adequately trained on the protocol, on the investigational products, and all trial-related activities. This may include, but are not limited to, screening, enrollment, management, adverse event reporting, data collection, all aspects of the product, the investigational product storage, distribution, and administration, and data collection and reporting. So that's a lot for them to have to manage, and they don't do it on their own. They must be familiar with the protocol, the PI, along with all study materials, so that they and their team can comply with good clinical practice, which I know you've heard about over and over again throughout this conference, and all the regulatory requirements. They need to ensure that the study is conducted ethically, and it involves protecting patient rights, safety, and well-being when they're doing the informed consent, as well as when they're continuing with the patient on treatment, that they're putting the patient first, as well as complying with the study requirements. They also oversee the quality and the data provided during sponsor and FDA audits to ensure timely reporting. In the clinic, the PI is going to work with the clinical research nurse here at City of Hope. And so this is the closest relationship with the study team, along with the CRC. The CRN helps to protect the integrity of the data trial, as well as help to protect the patient under good clinical practice. They do this by assessing the patient's understanding before they give informed consent. The CRN helps to facilitate the signature process with the PI as well as the patient, and document the consent in the electronic record. It is important that all elements of the consent are discussed as well as documented, because we all know if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. So that's oftentimes on the clinical research nurse to make sure that we're documenting what we talked about with the patient, as well as what the provider talked about with the patient. In addition to that, CRNs educate patients on what to expect from clinical trial activities, which include talking about screening visits. So we don't want to surprise the patient when you have a patient who expects to have a certain treatment. They think, oh, they're just going to come in for that treatment and that's all. But the reality is, especially with these immune effector cell studies, there's a lot that goes into these studies, and we don't want these patients to be surprised when they're asked to come in for screening visits, for the leukapheresis appointment, for follow-ups, for more screening prior to the start of treatment. And so, and then the follow-up afterwards. So we want to make sure that they're well aware of what the expectations are. There's things like biopsies, surgical port implants or catheter placements, cell collections, and then of course the treatment, the treatment visits that need to be adhered to. And so we want to talk about that all up front, especially with caregivers. Many of these patients are going to require caregivers for a good 6 weeks. And there's expectations that they not drive for 8 weeks after a cell product. And so these need to be talked about up front. For some of our patients, in fact, many of our patients come from long distances to City of Hope to get treatment, and they need to stay within 30 minutes of the hospital for the first 14 days, and then up to an hour to 2 hours, depending through day 28. And so they need to understand up front that this is what the expectation is. And that's generally the CRN that's all talking to them about that. We want to make sure that the patient knows who to contact and for what types of questions you contact that person. So as a CRN, typically we become the nexus for all the communication, but we want to make sure that the patient knows that if there's anything time sensitive, the symptoms are changing, they need to know who to contact, at 2 a.m. in the morning. And that's on typically the CRN that does that. We also help coordinate studies and clinical support activities, such as the screening eligibility and protocol-driven visits. So that means that we're helping to put in the orders under the doctor, making sure that the doctor is aware of what the activities are, coordinating with the APPs to put in biopsies and line placements, and then making sure that everything comes together so that we have a good screening in a packet. We'll put that together, and then the PI is going to review that and ultimately make the decision whether the patient is eligible, along with his signature, her signature, the CRN, the CRC, and the sponsor oftentimes will also be double checking the packet to make sure that the patient meets eligibility. In case you haven't heard it enough, the CRNs really are advocates, and as nurses, that is primarily our role, whether it be at the bedside, at the infusion pump, or in the clinical research nurse position. We always want to make sure that we're advocating for our patients. We are recording and grading adverse events for the PI to attribute and make sure that that gets collected to sent to sponsor and then ultimately reported to the FDA as needed within the time frame available. We're also going to serve as a hub for patient care and coordination between multiple study members. I talked a few minutes ago about being a nexus. And so when there's a clinical research nurse on the trial, oftentimes that's the person that people call. They don't call the PI because the PI is super busy. It's, usually easier to call the clinical research nurse, but you also want to make sure that the clinical research nurse is involved because that's who people go to find out what's going on with the patient generally, as a first run, if the PI is not available. So typically, you'll find if a patient is on a clinical trial, again, the CRN is typically looped in and becomes involved with all facets of the patient care coordination, from the floor to scheduling the appointments, to making sure that the nurses that are infusing the products are educated. We're creating research education guidance documents to make sure that they know what they're doing and understand the study before they infuse the patient. And the CRN is the one responsible for making sure that that education is there. We're also documenting what happens at the visits on a clinical research note, making sure that our AE logs are up to date with graded AE so that the PIs can attribute that. You'll find that CRNs not only work with the PIs and the APPs, but they also work with all the other research staff. So clinical research coordinators, associate clinical research coordinators, regulatory coordinators, biospecimen coordinators, the Office of IND Development and Regulatory Affairs, OIDRA, and also on the standard of care, we'll be working with admitting, scheduling the floor, clinic and infusion nurses, apheresis center, stem cell lab, pharmacy, radiology, and a heart station, just to name a few. So as you can see, we have our hands in a lot of the pots. Trying to help make sure that the care gets coordinated according to what the study parameters are and within the time frame needed. So the clinical research nurses are also involved with collecting and storing source documentation, such as patient diaries, questionnaires, along with tumor measurement forms before they're uploaded to the electronic data management systems that we have. They are also responsible for reviewing trial activities for feasibility and resource management. So this should be done hopefully up front. Assist with questions for study monitoring visits and audits. Oftentimes the CRCs are the primary person to receive the data queries. However, if there's questions about why or how the data was pulled and where that came from, then oftentimes they'll come to the clinical team to find that answer out. Some CRNs administer and carry out study-related activities which are ordered by the study physician, as long as they fall within the nursing scope of practice, such as questionnaires and nursing assessments. Some of those assessments may be what we call mini mental state exams, MMSEs, or effector cellular encephalopathy assessments, which shortened called ICE assessments, where we talk to patients and try to assess whether they have any neurotoxicities related to the immune effector cells. This is the handwriting test, and I know you've heard about earlier. And we're looking for changes in baseline. We're looking to see that the patient doesn't have any deviations from being able to say their name, to be able to say, give the names of commonly used items. That all falls within the CRN scope. At other facilities, some CRNs can assist in various clinical aspects of collection or administration, including to, but are not limited to, administering medications as well as blood draws. CRNs also help manage the submission of patient reimbursement and stipend requests as determined by the study. So some studies will allow a stipend or reimbursement of funds upfront. That's discussed at the clinical, at the consent. And so we want to set the expectations for the patients on what they need to do as far as collecting their receipts, making sure that they're turning in, we get the forms filled out that they need to be able to set up the reimbursement from the financial folks. Between scheduling, yesterday, Dara had talked about a day in the life of a CRN. And at Stanford, and many of those items do cross over to City of Hope, but we have a little bit of a different setup here. Our CRN days just typically look a little different, so I kind of wanted to briefly walk you through what that looks like. Our CRNs are assigned a portfolio for which they are responsible for learning and coordinating. They are the protocol content coordinator experts. So if there's ever a question, typically the floor will come to the CRN. When they come in the morning, they're typically going to start opening up their emails and looking for anything urgent or time sensitive from the treating teams or the patients. Next, they would be looking at their calendar to find out what kind of meetings that they have scheduled for the day, whether it be patient visits, site initiation visits, sponsor meetings, audits, or any other number of meetings that they might be having. It's important to understand that the patient always comes first. And so if the CRN comes in and there's something urgent going on, they're going to stop and start addressing that need as urgently as possible. So they also need to be looking at the electronic medical record to make sure that the patients that are on trial, that there's nothing emergent going on with those that are inpatient. And oftentimes, if there are, then they'll reach out to the PI and give them a heads up, even though the patient does have a treating team that's rounding on them, and specifically IEC trained here at City of Hope. The PI would still want to know as early as possible what's going on, as well as they're reaching out to the CRC to make sure that they know if there's any adverse events occurring as soon as possible, because there are timelines that those need to be reported both to the sponsor and then eventually to the FDA. The CRN might be involved with coordinating slots for studies. So some of these are competitive slots. And so we may be competing with other sites for 1 or 2 slots at any given time. And so we need to coordinate with the sponsor to see if we can even put a patient on. And we'll work with the CRC to make sure that we get the information needed for that, and then communicating that to the PI. The CRNs are also sometimes involved with pre-screening. So pre-screening is typically before the patient consents, but the PI is requesting that, there's a cursory review to make sure that on a high level, the patient looks eligible. So typically the CRN is going to look at the labs. They're going to look at the patient history, that there's not anything obvious that would exclude them. And especially with some of our more acute patients, those labs change very quickly. And so obviously that's not going to be what's used for eligibility, but we want to make sure that we're not trying to consent a patient that just very obviously would not be able to go on study. In between the scheduled events that are typically on the CRN's calendar, they're busy putting in orders on behalf of the PI. We want to we're typically looking at lab scans, patient visits with the physician or procedures, as well as the treatment visits. The CRN also helps coordinate the collection of samples. And so while we don't actually collect the samples, we are responsible for making sure that the orders are there, that everybody's aware that the kit, that if there's any coordination of the kits, oftentimes we'll be called to make sure that the kits get where they need to be by the time that the collection happens. Once a patient is consented, the CRN is responsible for submitting the patient and study information to the insurance authorization department. This is a key point, and I know Stacy had talked about the funding for these studies and the billing for the patients. We would never want to do any kind of study activity without insurance authorization, because we would never want the patient to get a bill that they should not be getting. And to the earlier point, we do want to make sure that the patient understands that when they go on a trial, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're never going to get a bill for anything. We do, as a CRN, need to make sure that we're educating our patients as to what the expectations are, what the study will pay for, what it will not pay for, and whether there's any kind of reimbursements or stipends. So the CRN will work with the patient to confirm the patient medical history using both the patient and the electronic medical records, as well as reaching out to other institutions to make sure that we're getting the most accurate information. So many of you probably use Epic, and so we have Care Everywhere that makes it very convenient to get information from other institutions, but not all institutions use a EMR that connects with Epic. And so oftentimes we'll have to reach out and make sure that we get the most recent records that would apply to what we're trying to put the patient on. So oftentimes that has to do with their latest treatments and washout periods, because we don't want to start screening a patient who's inside of a washout period, because then that way that screening wouldn't be effective, nor would they be able to go on trial. They're responsible for coordinating and collecting, prepping, and documenting each patient during the screening process. And in many cases, it requires the CRN to work very closely with the PI to confirm different elements of the eligibility. Once the eligibility packet is reviewed and signed off on, again, you're looking at anywhere from 3 to 4 people looking at this packet to confirm eligibility, which would be the PI, the CRN, the CRC, and then again, sometimes a sponsor. It's only at that point, once the patient's been confirmed with their eligibility, that we would then move forward with the treatment. So next, we're going to talk about the clinical research coordinator, and some core functions for the clinical research coordinator is that they are primarily sponsor facing, while the CRC is primarily clinic facing. And so the CRC is also given a portfolio of studies where he or she is expected to be the protocol expert. The CRN and the CRC work very closely together to ensure compliance and support. The CRC works diligently with sponsors to anticipate and mitigate the potential protocol non-compliance issues. Obviously, that would be something that would be a negative for the study. And so we want to make sure and try to mitigate that as much as we can. And as a result, the CRC is often working with the CRN to make sure that we're hitting the time points that we need. Completion of case reports, forms via paper or electronic record, coordination of collection, processing, and shipping of lab specimens with the support of ancillary staff, such as the associate clinical research coordinators, as well as the biospecimen coordinators. They're acting as a liaison for research subjects, investigators, IRB sponsor, and other healthcare professionals in between. So oftentimes they go on the sponsor calls and sponsor safety calls, as well as the CRNs, to find out what's going on with the study, to make sure that everybody is up to date with any AEs that needed to be reported, and as well as that would influence the treatment going forward for our patients. They also work with the storage and archival of source study and participant documents, which are mostly stored in electronic records, such as our EMR or electronic regulatory binders. The clinical research coordinators can either be licensed, so such as an RN or an MD, or they can be non-licensed. At some study locations, the CRN, CRC duties may overlap. Study care coordination, again, the study coordinators at some locations may do screening eligibility activities and protocol-driven activities. They're involved with retrospective chart reviews to find and report adverse events for the PI attribution, and then sending to sponsor so that as they upload it into the EDC. The clinical data coordinators are non-licensed personnel who are responsible for reliable data extraction from the patient's electronic chart, accurate data entry, and they enact quality controls to ensure protected health information is not released to inappropriate individuals with the entry of their data. The primary goal of the clinical coordinator is to provide high quality data and keeping the number of errors and delinquent data low. One more that I forgot to add on here, but is important, and I alluded to it earlier, was a biospecimen coordinator, and they're responsible for putting together the kits with the supplies that the sponsor provides so that we can get crucial data for the study to assess how the patient is responding to treatment by looking at the pharmacokinetics, which is how the body affects the product, and then pharmacodynamics, which is how the product affects the body. So those were, next week we'll talk about the regulatory coordinator. So the regulatory coordinator is responsible for the maintenance of the FDA Forms 1572. We also call it the Delegation of Authority Log, or DOL. They submit protocols and their amendments to the IRB, or institutional review boards. They keep track of the initial approval letters, progress reports, continuation reports, and annual study reviews. They also keep track of sponsor correspondence, training logs, investigational IND safety reports, and any solicitation of research participant advertising for recruitment and retention. So the final takeaways is that no clinical trial is conducted by any one person, while the PI is over all of these efforts and is ultimately responsible for the study as conducted at that site. He or she does not do it without the support of an entire team. And so how we do that is good communication, timely reporting, and complete documentation, which is essential for a well-run trial.